will be 2/3 of the cost of, so the cost will only be 1/3 to pay the heating bills and cooling bills of what it is now for this particular wing. So it's a huge improvement in performance that we want to get to. I talked about the birds and the bird safety. So with this triple glazing, the inner film is what controls the amount of light coming in. That's a gray or silver colored film. On the outside, the film has these printed dots, and the dots are the secret to preventing bird collisions. Here's some photographs of samples of glass that we have. The dots, which are called frits, are visible from close up, but really not visible at all from far away. But interestingly enough, New York City has just adopted these as a requirement. So the New York City Buildings Code requires that glass buildings have these bird-friendly materials and frits as of right now. So these are a code requirement and something that you will start seeing on glass buildings in New York City from here in, which we support and think it's a very progressive change. These are just details. All the areas at the top and the bottom and the sides of the curtain wall will remain exactly as they were. Better insulation, but the same profile. We're really just changing the glass. And then on to the rendering. This is what the glass looks like right now. You can see the grid of aluminum caps on the outside. And this is what the glass wall would look like per our proposal. So you can see the glass pieces are bigger. The grid is expressed just as these thin joints rather than the aluminum grid on the outside. And you can see a little bit of a hint of the change in glass as you go up from bottom to top. Again, we think it's a fairly subtle change and certainly keeps the idea of this as a single glass volume, but it does look different for the reasons that I described. Here's some other close-up views of the building and the glass as it is now and how it will look. But I think it's worth pointing out, and I think this is an important point, that it's not the case that you just walk up to this glass building and look at it as those renderings I just showed you. The building is actually up a hill and about 50 to 75 feet away from the path through Central Park, the pedestrian path on the south side of the building. So if you are a park goer, you'd be walking on this path on the lower right of the photograph, and you would really be seeing the glass wall through a screen of trees and in the distance. So we think that most people would actually not even notice the difference, given that it's really a background kind of building, the way it's sited. Similarly, looking at it from Fifth Avenue, here's the Fifth Avenue facade by McKimmon and White, and then the sloped glass wall is way in the background here. And we think that looking at it at an oblique angle, you might not notice much of the change. The Met asked us, just because there are other additions in the back of the building that are also glass, would you see the Rockefeller wing at the same time as the other glass walls, and would they look different? And the answer is that because the building is so big and the Rockefeller wing is around the corner of this very large footprint of the modern and contemporary art wing, you really would not end up seeing these at the same time. So we think it's really a standalone, a visual element. Just one other point about this, the Landmarks Commission staff said, well, it's great if you want to change the Rockefeller wing, but we can't just change pieces of the Met piecemeal. What about its twin that Brett mentioned on the north side, the Temple of Dendra wing, which actually looks very similar. And so what we did is we showed how the Temple of Dendra might look with a similar treatment. This is something that is not part of this proposal. It's not something that's scheduled or funded or anything like that. It could happen at some time in the future. If it ever did, then we would try to do something similar. And the Landmarks Commission just wanted to reassure them of that idea, even though this is not part of the application. So you can see in the wing, the Rockefeller wing at the bottom, Temple of Dendra in the north. They're really mirror images. One faces north, one faces south, but they are very similar. And the Temple of Dendra wing has the same problems with condensations and corrosion. So it eventually does need to be replaced. Here's what it looks like now with the iconic Egyptian temple on the inside. So eventually, at some point in the future, it could be that the Rockefeller wing and the Temple of Dendra will be, again, twins if this renovation project ever happens, something that might happen but is not definite now. Just running through this, those two wings, Rockefeller and Dendra, also have enormous skylight roofs. The Landmarks Commission was concerned about these as well. These are actually not visible from the park because it's a fairly flat roof, but we would eventually, here's pictures of what it looks like now. It's the similar kind of glass and mullion cap. So we would eventually replace those with a similar system. But again, that's not part of this current proposal. This is the last part of the presentation. Thank you for staying with me for this. There's a precedent for this, which is that we are working on another skylight replacement project, which is similar, which the Landmarks Commission approved in 2017. And that is this big block of European paintings galleries with skylights on the west side of the museum. There's an enormous west-facing slope of glass, which we replaced with a very similar system. It's about half done right now under construction. Half the galleries, paintings galleries, just reopened recently in the last week or two, while the other half will remain under construction for another 2 years. But this was a similar idea of a sloped glass. These illuminate paintings of galleries, of course, rather than the galleries that we're talking about. But the Landmarks Commission approved this change to this new system, again, based on the same reasons of just improved performance, improved thermal performance, improved condensation performance, and light transmittance. Those roofs have evolved over many years. And when we looked at this project with the Landmarks Commission, we noted that the skylights at the Met have been evolving continuously for more than 100 years. The technology keeps changing. What it looked like in the 19th century is very different from what that face looks like right now. And when we looked at the McKimmett and White drawings for skylight replacement in 1907, the skylights need to be replaced at the Met every 30, 40 years or so. In 1907, they said, this section is intended as a standard of quality. This is a skylight detail. The contractor shall use this type or another equally good to be approved by the architects, which we took to mean that really what's appropriate for the Met is to have the best possible skylight system. Skylight technology has evolved over the years, from the beginning of the 20th century to the middle to what we're proposing to install now. And we think for the sake of art conservation, it makes sense that the Met should always be able to install the best technology, since these investments in infrastructure are very dear and we really want to conserve the collection. It's a very subtle difference looking at the existing photograph of the west side and what we are proposing. This is a rendering. And then I'll end with some construction photos. On the right, you can see those new skylights installed on the west side of the museum, very similar to what we're proposing for the Rockefeller wing, but we think a very sound and subtle change to make a great investment in the Met's future. This is the last bit, which is just the construction schedule. The idea, if this all goes according to our schedule, is that construction on this project would begin in the fall of 2021, in October and November, and continue through 2022 and be finished at the end of 2022. So thank you very much for your attention and for listening to all this, and welcome your questions or comments.
Thank you, Mike. So I will open it up to questions from the committee first, and then from the public. You are asking for a letter of support. So that's
correct.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? I see a hand. I can't tell who it is.
Jason Villanueva. I'll ask a question, Elsie. Mike or Brett, if you could, or Alina, if you could email us a copy of this full presentation so we can keep for our records, we'd appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. We can do that. We have it's too big to email, but we have a link so you can download it. It's easily
Perfect.
sent.
I like links.
Yep.
I guess I had a question. I know that you mentioned you spoke with Community Board 8, and I believe Central Park is in Community Board 7, correct?
Right. So far we have presented to Community Board 8, 5, 9, and 10, and then tomorrow night we're going to 7, which is the upper west side.
Upper West Side and Central Park. Okay, and they've all extended letters of support.
So we have so we saw 8 first, and they gave us a letter of approval. Community Board 5 decided to agree and go along with whatever Community 8 said. We got a vote of approval from Community Board 9, Community Board 10. Last night they did not have a full quorum, but they said that they were going to recommend approval to their executive committee. And that's who we've seen so far.
Okay, thank you. I see Jessica's hand up.
Thanks, Elsie. Thank you for the presentation.
Mhm.
I think, you know, it's wonderful to hear about advancing technology in architecture being deployed to support cultural institutions like the Met. And I think that this particular renovation is going to be a wonderful opportunity for the Met to reconsider the specific presentation of the materials that they have housed here, and it will be a market improvement, I don't doubt. As far as its impact on Community Board 11, I think it, you know, it faces south and we are north. So I think a letter of support would be a good neighborly gesture, but I think there's very little impact that your project has on our residents. I do appreciate that we are part of Museum Mile, and that this is one of the sort of foundational points along that mile. I don't really have any questions for you, but I appreciate the presentation and recognize the outreach. Landmarks has, I guess my question is, Landmarks is in approval of your approach, correct?
Well, we are going to Landmarks Commission to seek their approval, and but they asked us first to go to these 6 community boards, including yourselves, and then we will see what Landmarks says. We've met with staff informally, and they said they thought it was a very reasonable proposal. But we won't know for sure what all the commissioners will vote on until we get there in February.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like a very reasonable proposal is what you have from Landmarks so far. So I would agree. And I guess we will debate as a committee if we are moved to motion on a letter of support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jason?
I'm sorry, my microphone wasn't working last time. Thank you for your presentation. My questions is probably more to the policy process. I seen the resolution from Community Board 8, which shows that they're in support of the project. I was looking for the application that you submitted to LPC. And since you're correlating this to another project, I would like to see the approval of that other project. Not necessarily it's going to hinder my vote, because Madam Chair, I am moved to make a motion after any other committee members want to deliberate about the matter. But I would like to see the application that was submitted for this project, as well as the approval of the previous project that is under construction that you're correlating this project with.
Oh, you mean the Landmarks approval for those European painting skylights that I showed you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yeah, no, we have that, and we can send that, and then we'll send a link for this application, which is this presentation, so you can look at it if that's what you mean by what you meant by the application.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other committee members? Now I'll go to attendees. I don't see any.
I'm ready to make a motion, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Jason.
I motion to provide a letter of support and approval of this project.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you, Jessica. Can we take a vote? Angel, can you call?
Certainly. Jessica, excuse me, Jessica Elliott,
Do you hear me? Yes.
oh, thank you. Elsie,
Yes.
Joe Goldblum.
Yes.
Thank you, Joe.
Yes.
Thank you. Ivy Hume,
Yes.
Francis Mastroda? I saw her name. Where'd she go?
I saw her too. Oh, she's saying yes. I can read her lips. I don't know if it counts. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, Francis.
Got you,
Jessica,
Fran.
Jessica Morris,
Yes.
Andrew Padilla,
Yes.
Vinnie Torres, Vinnie Torres, Steven Villanueva's excused, Jason Villanueva,
Yes.
and Candy is not present.
Yes.
Oh, you came in. There you go. Thank you, Candy. Okay, motion passes.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So Brett and team, this recommendation will be forwarded to our full board, which will vote later this month. If the full board goes along, then then the letter will be issued the next day or so after that.
Great. Thank you so much to everybody.
No problem. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Okay.
All right, Angel. Oh, Mike, can you stop sharing your screen so we can?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Okay. So our next agenda item is our informational presentation regarding the City Council's planning together, a new comprehensive planning framework for the New York City. To also be 20 minutes. Is Annie here?
She is.
Yes, I'm here. I was muted.
Yes. Okay, perfect.
Okay, great. Should I go ahead and share my screen and get
Yep, you're all
started?
set. Go ahead.
Okay, great. And thank you to Angel and to George for inviting me to be here tonight and connecting me to you all. Let's see. All right, see my screen. My name is Annie Levers. I am the Assistant Deputy Director of the Office of Strategic Initiatives at the City Council. And the council started working on this proposal under the direction of Speaker Johnson during the 2019 Charter Revision Commission. The speaker was supportive of implementing comprehensive planning through that process, but when the commission decided not to take up the issue, we continued to work on a proposal internally at the council that could be enacted via local law. So it could be adopted by the council. So the proposal that I'll describe here today would amend the charter, but it would not require a referendum. It comes along with a report, Planning Together, and a bill that was introduced that's very long and would impose this framework. So I'm going to ask folks, I guess this seems like standard practice, but to just keep their questions to the end. I have a lot in this PowerPoint, and I apologize in advance for how text heavy it is, but I suspect I'll answer your questions as I get to later slides. So I'm sure there's a lot of experience in this room, so I won't spend a ton of time on this slide, and the report really does go into detail on each of these issues. But these were really the key issues that we were seeking to address from the council from the get-go with this project. In short, the city's planning mandates are insufficient, they're scattered, they're
I don't
confusing.
think we can see your screen where you're.
Oh, no.
It's still on the first page.
Interesting. Let's try that again.
I was just thinking the same. I didn't see a presentation. I saw Adobe.
That's interesting. Can you see it now?
Yes.
On key issues? Okay. And you can,
Yes.
and it, if I do this, it's the next slide. Okay, great. Thank you. So starting over, these are the key issues that we were seeking to address. In short, the city's planning mandates in terms of citywide assessments of our needs, we found to be insufficient. They're scattered across a lot of different planning documents that are required by the charter, and they're confusing, honestly. Like a lot of them don't connect to each other, or if they do connect to each other, it's unclear how or why they're supposed to. And this leads to inefficiencies and a lack of coordination across the city, across and between city agencies. The opposition to rezonings is obviously growing more and more each day, and we believe that's in part because our planning regime is purely reactionary, and there are very few opportunities for neighborhoods to proactively plan for themselves, which forces communities into defensive positions, reacting to developer proposals and city, rezonings only. So our piecemeal rezonings have at times exacerbated inequality. It's left neighborhoods with sort of an uneven landscape with respect to zoning and infrastructure needs, and contributed to the deprioritization of the needs of low-income people, immigrants, and people of color. Our piecemeal process also extends to the budget. So our budget decisions are almost entirely divorced from assessments of capital needs, which are also totally insufficient. And our budget decisions are often divorced almost entirely from our policy and land use priorities as a city as a whole. So we wrote this report. It is designed specifically, and the proposal is designed specifically to center issues of equity, access to housing, and sustainability. As I mentioned, it comes along with a bill that was already introduced, held by Speaker Johnson, that would, implement the framework. So our first task really was to sort of pick up where the Charter Revision Commission left off, and they identified all of these plans and reports that you see on the left-hand side of the screen that are already required by the Charter, and they could together be conceived of as a comprehensive plan of some kind, but the Charter fails to sort of make clear whether and how they connect to each other and whether they're supposed to build on the work of one another. And on the right, you'll see a depiction of the new cycle that we're proposing, which I'll go into greater detail throughout this presentation. But the idea is to just connect all of these disjointed documents and processes and reports that are already required by the city charter to create one citywide strategic framework and vision for the city's future growth and development. So now I'll really walk you through the planning process itself and how key stakeholders fit into and inform that process. And at this point, I think it's worth acknowledging that we specifically designed the process to provide communities with sort of equal opportunity to proactively plan for their neighborhoods while addressing citywide issues of, citywide challenges like our housing crisis and the climate crisis. And that we've designed sort of what would be sort of like the skeleton of the comp plan's public engagement process that seeks to balance community-based planning with citywide planning. But there are obvious limitations to what we can require via legislation. In short, we can't legislate city agencies or city bureaucrats into being good at their jobs. So what we did is did our best really to design a process that laid a solid foundation for good planning work to occur, with a new and thorough conditions of the city report, requirements to prioritize growth and development in neighborhoods with high access to opportunity and low risk for displacement, and the creation of these sort of clearly articulated milestones for public engagement that give the city and communities sufficient time and flexibility to sort of organize and improve upon the process over time. So this is a lot on one slide. This is going to sort of give you an overview of what the process would look like from start to finish, and it's going to sort of gloss over a lot of details, but I'll dig into the details later in the presentation. So first in this process, the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, which is a mayoral office that already exists, they put together the Plan YC reports that come out, the 1NYC reports. So they would be in charge of this process, and they would assess the city's demographics, climate risks, displacement risk, access to opportunity, prior plans, including 197A plans and recent rezonings, impacts of those recent rezonings compared to the stated goals of the rezoning, and a first ever robust assessment of the city's physical infrastructure needs. OLTPS would then work with a new steering committee, which I'll describe a bit later, to determine the city's long-term needs for housing, jobs, open space, schools, and other critical infrastructure, and these would be measurable citywide targets. And then through a robust public engagement process that we created the skeleton for, New Yorkers would help decide where and how the city would distribute that critical infrastructure in their neighborhoods over the next 10 years. Based on public input, prior plans, existing conditions, OLTPS would then develop 3 potential land use scenarios reflecting New Yorkers' needs, prioritizing growth in neighborhoods that have high access to opportunity and low risk for displacement. That would be a requirement in the law. And then these scenarios would be included in a draft long-term plan that would also identify investment priorities for every community district, regardless of whether or not those neighborhoods were going to get rezoned. Next in the process, community boards, borough presidents, and the steering committee would be required to adopt a preferred land use scenario or design a scenario of their own to make a recommendation. Ultimately, the New York City Council would be responsible for considering all of that input, all of those recommendations, and reconciling those recommendations from various stakeholders to adopt a preferred scenario for every community district. OLTPS would then include that adopted scenario in a final long-term plan. And if the council didn't, act and they weren't able to come to a consensus on what to adopt, OLTPS would ultimately adopt a preferred scenario. Future rezoning applications at ULURP would describe whether or not the action does or does not align with the final long-term plan. That's really the only substantive change to what ULURP would look like. There's no changes to timeline or anything. And then all budget planning documents would reflect the priorities identified in the plan, including annual reports on how much money is committed and still needed to meet all of the investment priorities in the plan, from the citywide priorities to the neighborhood level priorities. So this slide depicts the key stakeholders that are directly implicated by the process we designed. It was important to us to provide opportunities for members of the general public to provide public comment on the proposal directly throughout the entire process. Community boards, borough presidents, and the city council would have very specific roles and would be active throughout that I'll go through in more detail. The Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability would be the coordinating office, working with city agencies to produce the analysis and the public-facing documents. And a new long-term planning steering committee and borough steering committees would subsume an existing steering committee that already exists and doesn't do very much, honestly, that oversees the Plan NYC report. And finally, the CPC would play an ongoing role in their review and certification of ULURP applications, looking at consistency with the final long-term plan. So just a couple of words about this Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. I mentioned that it already exists. They refer to themselves as the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. They dropped the long-term planning from their name, which is symbolic of where their priorities are at the moment. But we've really sat this task with them because they already put together this very good report that, right now sort of looks like a long list of mayoral initiatives. I think the first iteration looked a lot more like a comprehensive plan. So they have experience doing this, and it's a mayoral office. I think city agencies are notoriously bad at coordinating with one another on infrastructure issues in particular. So our proposal tasks the development and coordination of this proposal with a mayoral office, which would be well situated to coordinate across city agencies. This new long-term planning steering committee, as I mentioned, would subsume the role of the Sustainability Advisory Board, which currently exists. And would be given a lot more responsibility in this long-term planning process. So it would be appointed by a mix of elected officials. 4 would be appointed by the mayor, 4 would be appointed by the city council, and then each borough president would get 1 appointee. And this would be a technical body. They would have requirements for issue and technical expertise and be required to be representative of groups or individuals historically underrepresented or excluded from planning and land use decisions. They would also be required to convene demographically diverse borough steering committees to support deeper levels of engagement throughout the first 3 years of the planning process. And their role in the long-term planning process really would be to adopt these citywide targets for growth and a criteria and methodology for actually distributing that growth throughout the city in a way that is equitable. And that would be required in the charter to also prioritize growth in neighborhoods with high access to opportunity and low risk for displacement. But this this body would sort of flesh that out in greater detail and assess sort of where, if growth is appropriate at the time, where it should go and how. They would also, and those targets, I'm sorry, would be binding. So the city would be required to include those targets in their long-term plan. They would then adopt preferred land use scenarios of their own. Those would be advisory. And they would play an ongoing oversight role with annual hearings. So this would be a standing body that would be held up throughout the 10-year cycle. So the plan itself, this is a 10-year process that has an opportunity for amendment halfway through the process, and is, you know, once it's done, it starts over again. So it's about planning, not the plan. And that's why we, you know, designed it to be sort of cyclical and build on one another and then start anew. But the first plan and every, you know, major plan at that milestone would take essentially 4 years to complete, from the start of the, you know, appointment of the steering committee to the production and finalization of the long-term plan. The graphic on the left sort of outlines the points at which the bill will require public meetings, adoption of formal recommendations, and council adoption. We essentially required some form of public engagement before and after the production of each formal document in the planning process. Again, these should be regarded as bare minimum requirements. Altogether, all told, it's like 780 meetings or something like that over the 4-year period that we're requiring. But again, you know, that's not enough. So this really would be like something to build on. And we would require these clear milestones where everyone would know, you know, the city is set to release the conditions of the city report in 3 months. They are required to do public engagement before that, and we can organize around it. So these are, again, intended to be viewed as baseline minimum requirements, and it would take 4 years to produce that first plan. This slide really goes into very specific detail about the plan adoption process, which we wanted to bring as many stakeholders into as possible. Plan YC is a document that's produced by a mayor. It has no requirements for public input whatsoever, and it's not adopted by any bodies such as the council or community boards. And we wanted to create a framework that was in line with best practices for comprehensive planning, that had some sort of reconciliation process across bodies of government and with the public, so that we could all come to an agreement and adopt a plan that met our collective needs. So the first step in the adoption process would be that, based on public input, community board meetings, existing 197A plans, studies, new growth targets, OLTPS would produce 3 possible land use scenarios for every single community district. And these would be regarded as like resources for folks to consider, look at, and use in their deliberations. The city would also provide online, accessible, and in-person opportunities for members of the general public to comment directly, including facilitated public meetings in every community district. And then each of these bodies, the long-term planning steering committee, the borough steering committees, every community board, all the borough presidents, would be required to adopt advisory preferred land use scenarios for relevant community districts. So the bill requires them to adopt a preferred scenario, but it does not require them to adopt one of the 3 scenarios drafted by OLTPS. So that gives folks flexibility. In addition, these bodies can recommend changes to the district level targets that would be considered in the adoption process. Ultimately, the city council would be responsible for considering and reconciling those recommendations from the public, the steering committee, community boards, borough presidents, etc., to adopt a preferred land use scenario for every single community district. Again, the bill does not require the council to adopt one of the 3 scenarios produced by OLTPS. Those would be considered like resources, but it would require the council to adopt the preferred scenarios in the form of one resolution. And that's really intended to ensure that council members work together to meet our citywide and neighborhood specific goals. And we're not just shifting growth from one district to the next and horse trading. We're all working together to meet those citywide targets and create a cohesive plan that works together. So if the council fails to do all of that, OLTPS would adopt a preferred scenario and provide a rationale for how that decision was made. That's sort of like a fail-safe. It's very similar to what we have in the charter with respect to the budget. And so it's never actually happened that the council hasn't adopted the budget, but if we didn't adopt the budget, the mayor would just move ahead with his plan. And then finally, once the first final long-term plan is completed, the City Planning Commission would be responsible for determining which future ULURP applications align, conflict, or are not relevant to the long-term plan. Compliance with the long-term plan would be encouraged and considered and incentivized, but not required. So in all of our rezoning actions. So each ULURP would be required to include this statement of alignment, which would describe how the plan or how the application aligns, conflicts, or is not relevant to the plan's preferred land use scenario. The CPC would be responsible for reviewing those statements of alignment along with the ULURP application. And if the CPC approves or modifies an application that conflicts with the long-term plan, they have to basically explain themselves. To assess the broad impacts of the plan and incentivize implementation, we included a requirement for the city to produce a generic environmental impact statement. So that would simultaneously ensure that we are assessing the impacts of the long-term plan on our communities, while also reducing developer secret compliance obligations for subsequent proposed actions carried out in conformance with the conditions and thresholds of that GEIS. So that projects that align with the long-term plan would only be required to produce supplemental environmental review documents that are specific to the project, like construction or shadows. And this GEIS would assess the broader impacts of, adding X number of housing units to the city. This is something that a lot of other cities use in their comprehensive planning processes. Seattle does it, and they do sort of like a broad level assessment, and then developers do supplemental materials to assess the impacts of the specific project at hand. Applications that are consistent with the final long-term plan would not require council approval. They would be like a call up, like you see for a special permit or a sidewalk cafe. But they can be called up where the council either disagrees with the CPC's determination, which I'm sure will happen, of consistency. So the council disagrees that it is consistent, or otherwise determines that the application requires approval by the council. There's some other issue with the proposal. But the idea with this sort of call up is that in some cases where a proposal is consistent, the council would not have to, review and hear the proposal. It would simply align with the vision outlined in the long-term plan and move to the approval process. I'm really sorry for how this is formatted. It's impossible to read, but this is our budget slide, which I guess is appropriate to be very dry and text heavy. But there's a couple of ways that we have really significantly strengthened the budget process, and I think folks are really focused on the land use elements of this proposal, which I love also. But the budget is actually where we're making a lot of the biggest substantive reforms, or where we're proposing the most substantive reforms. So the physical needs assessment, it would be included in the conditions of the city report, which is my favorite piece of this proposal. And it's just like the existing conditions report. It would be like the first time we're putting all of this data all in one place. And it would be a citywide examination and evaluation of all of the city's existing buildings and infrastructure that would contain a recommendation of whether to repair, replace, or maintain each capital asset, and an assessment of the urgency of that need, which is something that all of our current capital infrastructure assessment documents are missing. So we know what needs to be done, but we don't know what needs to be done first or in what neighborhoods. And that's a really big problem. So each capital asset would also be given a resiliency score, which would also be very new. That would look at the infrastructure's, resiliency or risk with respect to climate risks like sea level rise or extreme weather. The long-term plan itself would include a lot of specific budget details, and it would be required to include a narrative of the budget implications for each citywide priority, including estimates for total costs and the existing budget commitments where applicable. And then all of the district level targets for open space, schools, etc., would be accompanied by the budget needs of the district under current conditions, any existing budget commitments that are already in place, and any additional capital needs to accommodate the district level targets. So this is really intended to create true transparency and accountability in this long-term plan to say, put your money where your mouth is. This is how much everything's going to cost and how much we've allocated to date. The 10-year capital strategy, we're really fully reimagining, honestly. The new proposed 10-year capital strategy would be divided into 2 sections. The first would just estimate the total cost of everything identified in the physical needs assessment, where we're looking at our current infrastructure and saying, okay, what do we need? What money do we need in order to maintain and repair all the infrastructure we have right now? So that would be the first half of the document. And then the second half of the document would be a narrative strategy aligned with the long-term plan, including the district level targets, that would assess the cost of the enhanced infrastructure that they want to implement, presented without regard to the availability of funds, representing sort of like a wish list of capital funds. Then in the annual budget process, each executive budget would include an itemized list of the needs outlined by the 10-year capital strategy that are included in that year's appropriations. And then the capital commitment plan would remain on the same reporting schedule, but it would be extended over 10 years. Right now it covers 3 to 5. And it would demonstrate the priorities of the current administration in a limited resources environment. So the 10-year capital strategy would be the wish lists that we would create once every 5 years. And then the capital commitment plan would be produced once a year, or on multiple times a year, really. And it would say, okay, here's the money we have, here's what we're going to spend, and here's how it aligns with that 10-year capital strategy and the final long-term plan. If it deviated in any way, it would need to explain itself. And then finally, there's a document that almost nobody knows exists, but it does, and it's the Asset Information Management System report, the AIMS report. This is a document that currently assesses infrastructure. It's really the only document that assesses our infrastructure, but it has a threshold of $10 million, which leaves out a lot of the smaller repair needs. And so we would eliminate that threshold and amend it to only include an assessment of the assets identified to be in poor and urgent condition in the physical needs assessment. So this would be like a running accountability report, essentially, on like, what are our most urgent needs, how are we doing on spending that money, and what do we need to spend in order to address those urgent needs next year. Finally, this is just an overview of the whole 10-year process. So through year 1 through 4, that's when you're really producing the first final long-term plan. And then halfway through in year 7, you would start an amendment process. Essentially, you would refresh that conditions of the city report. So you're creating it, you're producing that report once every 5 years on a regular basis. And then the mayor would have the opportunity to propose amendments to the final long-term plan. If those amendments were very significant, which we've defined in the bill as, a 10% difference in the citywide targets that were set in that citywide goals statement for housing, open space, schools, et cetera, then it would trigger a requirement for that plan to come back to the council for adoption. If the changes are really just, around the edges and not substantive, it would not require council adoption. So that's the presentation. I have actually a lot of slides in the appendix that I hope will help answer any questions that you have. It's a really detailed and dense proposal, so I didn't want to bore you too much with all of those details. I'm happy to pull them up as needed. In terms of sort of why I'm here and what our timeline is, I think we are having conversations with folks and community boards and organizations by request to get your thoughts and hear out any questions that you have and answer and provide information. The next step in the legislative process would be a hearing. We don't have a hearing scheduled yet. And then, from there, we would move through negotiation and amendments and adoption. So that's my presentation, and I guess I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Annie. So we have quite a few hands up, and this was a lot of information. I did want to give George an opportunity to speak. I know that he and I spoke last week regarding this presentation. So George, if there's anything you wanted to say and put into context before we open up for questions.
Sure, Elsie, I have a lot, so you'll shut me up when it's time for me to shut up, okay?
Okay.
All right, so I'm gonna just kind of in a 2-minute version summarize what I'm hearing is that we have this committee, the Long Range Planning Committee. They're going to set these targets, these growth targets, and they're going to be assigned to each community district. And that these growth targets that are assigned to community districts, they're binding. They're like, we're going to come back to that. And then the mayor's office, the office of whatever, but it's the mayor's office, are going to essentially conduct public engagement in every community district, where essentially they will get input from people in the community district, community boards, but everybody in the community district on, let's stick to land use right now, is on the growth targets and where growth in the community district is appropriate. And then after they get that input, the mayor's office is going to write and publish a draft plan that includes 3 land use scenarios. And then those 3 land use scenarios will go to the community boards and the borough presidents, and they're going to recommend them. Now, what I'm saying, recommend one of them. Now, what I'm saying is
So I want to interrupt you just there with one clarification, is that
sure.
They do not need to recommend one of the 3 scenarios produced by the mayor's office. They could could recommend a scenario of their own. So for example, in East Harlem, if they for whatever reason deviated from the plan you all have already put together, you would be able to come back and adopt a version that you all worked on for many years, maybe with some updates and additions, and you would recommend that to the council, and that's what would be sent to the council for consideration.
Okay, so I like that.
That's good. I'm glad you like that.
So I'm new to legislation, so I'm learning as I'm going along here. But when you read the report that you published, it doesn't say what you just said, right? It says that the mayor's office will develop those scenarios with input, and then they will be given to the community board and the borough presidents, and they will pick one. That's what it says. Now, what you're saying, I think, from our past communication on this, is something that would be essentially developed in the rulemaking process, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, what it says in the statute is that, OLTPS would be required to produce these 3 scenarios. And that's kind of like where the life of those 3 scenarios, I'm sorry, my puppy is squeaking her toy. But that's where the life of those 3 scenarios could end, right? So like they are required to provide those because they need to be produced as a resource for neighborhoods to really look at and consider, and that is what they would be provided with to review and think about amendments to the targets and how they would want to sort of shift things around. Then when it comes to the community board's requirement to adopt a preferred scenario, the statute does not refer specifically to the 3 that were produced by OLTPS. It simply states a preferred scenario, and it defines the preferred scenario as a land use framework, essentially, the ones that you would see that are produced right before a rezoning, that have some different types of land uses and relative height and density, not like a zoning map that's super specific, but like medium density, housing, mixed use, etc.
Yeah.
So we're not, the bill text would not require like an ABC multiple choice adoption.
Okay, all right.
It would leave it flexible. Yeah.
Well, okay. So going back to the earlier part about community engagement, I think there's been really mixed, or even let's just say bad history with the mayor's office leading community engagement. And in fact, some of the best community engagement I've ever seen is when it's community-led community engagement, as opposed to mayor's office staff. I mean, because when people from the mayor's office or from the administration come in and run these things professionally, they're all professional, but it's very clear they're not working for the people they're engaging, right? And that's a real problem. That's a real problem with engagement, is that if they're not, essentially working for the people who are local, it's not honest. It's not good. and I guess, what about the idea of properly resourcing community boards and community-based organizations to do their own engagement. I mean, because the way you describe it here with the mayor's office is that it's going to need an enormous amount of resources for the mayor's office to do this.
Yeah.
And if essentially, instead of just giving resources to the mayor, more resources to the mayor's office, which already has an Office of Public Engagement, to do this, why not just properly resource local agencies like community boards to do this sort of engagement on their own? We, in East Harlem, not everybody on this committee remembers this, but it was fantastic during the East Harlem neighborhood planning process, and it was fantastic for two reasons. It was because it was properly resourced by the speaker at the time, and it was community led.
Yeah. No, and I think that I agree with everything that you just said fundamentally. I think there really are, and I tried to hit this off in my presentation, and I'm not sure how else to phrase it, but it's difficult, if not impossible, to legislate resources. And we've heard this comment many times. I think we knew that this was going to be a discussion the moment this report was public, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. But legislating good planning resources is a very difficult task.
If you are legislating responsibility to the mayor's office for this,
well, that was going to be my. If you let me finish, my next. I think what we're trying to do with this report is force the city to provide resources to citywide planning, right? This is something that the city right now has the resources to do. We have community engagement across every single agency. Every agency is doing planning work of their own. They're doing it differently, some better than others. And you have to sort of if you want to go through a rezoning, you're sort of picking and choosing which agency you want to run the process based on how you think it went in another neighborhood. And if you aren't, I think the community-based planning that you were able to do in East Harlem, I think did have a lot to do with the speaker's resources and buy-in with the project. And that's the kind of thing that you just simply can't legislate. But what you can do is force the city's hand to say, this is happening. You are going to be required to go into every community board and stand up in front of this plan and talk about it in a way that doesn't get completely panned and doesn't get you shouted out of the room. And so we're requiring this skeleton framework for them to actually provide those resources, right? And that is hard to legislate in terms of exactly what specifically every neighborhood will need. And I don't think that every neighborhood is going to need the same thing. Even every neighborhood won't need a professional planner. Every neighborhood might need a facilitator, more than a technical planner on staff. And so, the bill is just not going to go in that level of detail. But I hear you that the resource question is not just oh, we're going to need a lot of it, which is, of course, what the administration, I'm sure, will say, is that this is going to be too expensive for us to do. But that we need the right engagement and resources in every neighborhood. So we're continuing to have these conversations, but our intent really is to create equal opportunity for each of those neighborhoods to get the resources they need to participate in this process. I don't think that this is going to solve all of our planning problems, just so everyone knows. We are not naively saying that comprehensive planning is going to fix everything. I strongly personally believe that we will not be able to even start fixing the problems with respect to inequality with our infrastructure and our neighborhoods and our zoning code without some sort of comprehensive citywide process. And so that's the framework that we laid out.
Okay.
Thank you. We have 3 hands up, George. So I'm just gonna move on. Jessica Elliott, I believe your hand was up first.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm trying to take notes at the same time. George is right, in my opinion, about local engagement, and research that I've read shows that more effective results are built from the people experiencing the problems. And speaking from my own experience in the community, where I'm a relatively new member, it seems that as a community board so far, we have experienced a process that in many cases involves us too late in the process and does not allow for enough engagement and due diligence from our volunteer community board members. I know what you're proposing and presenting today might seem like a lot of extra steps, but I think there's a possibility that it could be a step in the right direction to get better results on important and impactful decisions. So I'm approaching this plan with caution, but I do hope that we can find a path that will allow for deeper engagement processes and the real opportunity for underrepresented populations to have a voice in the large-scale initiatives that impact their health, economic opportunity, and well-being. The urgency and needs assessments would be a huge help to projects in our neighborhood, like the East River Esplanade, and overall underinvestment in neighborhoods like ours. You mentioned equal opportunity, but I think the need is definitely greater in some neighborhoods than others. So I hope that is factored into how those decisions are made. But I agree with George that this community board should be given more agency and more resources, and that our role should be integral in uplifting the voices and needs of our residents. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Not a question.
Yeah, I enjoyed listening. Thank you.
Andrew?
Hi, good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. First, thank you for the presentation, and thank you, George, for bringing up those concerns. You're always so on it, and there was a lot there. I feel like I have so many questions, but I'm going to try and limit them. I think I'm going to focus first on what felt like the lead getting buried there. Currently, councilmember deference, which Corey Johnson has spoken out against since the beginning of his time as speaker, is kind of one of the last safeguards communities have to protect themselves from harmful zoning actions that could hasten a wider range of ills, including gentrification. As we saw a few months ago, Councilmember Menchaca used council deference to stop the Sunset Park rezoning just a few months ago, right? That was over concerns over how the rezoning would increase gentrification and displacement in that community. I know some people have mentioned the East Harlem neighborhood plan. Well, part of the resources that Melissa Mark Viverito was able to bring during that process were in part because of her role as speaker, but in part because of member deference, right? She could still at the end have just held it up. So how does this plan, and I heard a bit here, but how does this plan change council member deference? And I have a few more questions, but I just wanted to see if you could just succinctly say, what can a council member not do now?
Nothing. It doesn't change anything with respect. The short answer, so that you could move on to your second question, is that it doesn't change anything. So the call-up option that we've described on this one of these slides. Now I'm not going to be able to find it. Yeah, council call-up. You know, as I'm sure you all are familiar with, sidewalk cafes, special permits all apply to this call-up option. We're actually, you know, curtailed from curtailing ourselves. I know that sounds ridiculous, but like we as a body cannot adopt a law that changes the fundamental powers of the council, which means that we cannot enact a local law that removes our ability to approve or deny ULURP applications. So this simply just creates a pathway for a council member not to call it up if they saw that it was not, you know, a controversial or conflicting application, but they would still be able to do so, and you know, the process would look exactly the same.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused. So it says council call applications that are consistent with the final long-term plan will not require council approval,
but can be called up where the council disagrees with the CPC's determination. So it's the same way that a special permit or a sidewalk cafe works right now. The rules of the city council stipulate exactly what that looks like. Right now, that requires a council member who's sitting in that district to get 7 signatures from his or her colleagues, and then it would just be, you know, sent up to a regular hearing through the regular council process.
So basically now the burden would be shifted onto the council member, as opposed to this having to now go through a vote. If it's consistent with the final plan, it wouldn't need one. It would now be up to the council member to push the issue. Is that correct?
Exactly. And I mean, that's the same way it sounds like you're in favor of member deference, and that's very similar to how member deference works, right? Like the member uses their influence and their knowledge of the district to make the case for or against an application, and they would still be in the same position to do so now. There would just be one, basically piece of paper they need to file in order to call that up for council review and approval.
A piece of paper they would need to file and 7 signatures from their colleagues.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Which
Right,
is
but
I very, very commonly done. I don't want it to sound like something. It's not like a filing with like the city clerk. It's like a piece of paper you submit to an administrative agent at the council. So it's not
now,
like
now, so when we're talking about consistent with the final long-term plan, I just wanted a bit more of clarification on that. I don't want to oversimplify, but who would adjudicate that?
the city planning commission would be responsible for determining whether the application aligns or conflicts with the plan. But a council member could still call something up if it, obviously disagrees with that determination. And if they decide it conflicts, it automatically goes to the council for review.
Mm-hmm. And then it would seem as though a lot of this process is kind of front-ended in these it seems like these steering committees kind of get a bit more power in this scenario. Is that correct?
The steering committee is envisioned as a body that would help, it's really a technical body that would really do the hard work of figuring out how much growth and investments we need over the course of the next 10 years to face our citywide challenges. The binding targets is simply imposing a target on the plan itself. But as I described, I know this is so complicated, but the plan is not binding. So like if the target for the neighborhood would be set, and that target would be required to be accommodated by the land use scenario that's produced by OLTPS. And then the council would also, adopt a scenario of their own, but the targets themselves cannot be and are not under this proposal, like enforced in any strict way with respect to rezoning applications, if that makes sense. It's just simply what the targets have to be included in the long-term plan, which is that guiding document for producing those land use scenarios. That was a really complicated answer. So
right. I guess I'll just try and rephrase the question and see if I can get a simpler one. So let's say the long-term plan says we need to solve homelessness. And again, if this is a bad example, you let me know. Let's say that's one of the goals, right? To address homelessness. It can certainly be argued that upzoning would help by providing more housing, as an example. But it could also be argued that alternative actions like taxing and capturing private land would better solve homelessness, since we have far more vacancies in New York City than we do homeless people.
For sure.
So in the event that a council member looks at this and is like, neither of these 3 plans, let's say at that moment, there's a lot of community energy saying, neither of these 3 plans meet the moment, and you're the council member faced with that. You've kind of got this, you've got the mayor and you've got real estate pointing at the sign saying, y'all already agreed to this. And you've got community members saying, well, neither of these 3 plans really solve the targeted problems in the way we envision it. Again, just walk us through what would be processed there if the council member feels, I don't really think this makes sense, but the planning commission feels as though the options conform with the final plan and targets.
Oh, okay. Now I'm a bit confused. So the city council would adopt the preferred land use scenarios for the final long-term plan.
Right.
In your first scenario,
there is no. Let's say at the tail end there is no preferred scenario. Let's say after this, none of the plans are really all that good, which is totally possible in New York politics. Let's say after this whole long process, sadly, we spent a lot of time and energy, but these plans aren't very good. What happens then if the council member and community members feel like these plans aren't very good and we actually don't think any of them make sense?
For a specific district, that's what you mean?
Yes. Let's say it's East Harlem, just for example. Let's say East Harlem, there are these 3 plans and they might conform with targets that had been set months ago, years ago, excuse me, but we're looking at them and the plans at final, given the conditions in the neighborhood. Not just the council member by their lonesome, but people in the community are like, I don't think these make sense. And no action seems better than any of these three. What happens then?
So if the whole city council fails to adopt preferred land use scenarios, the city would adopt preferred land use scenarios of their own. And that's really intended to force our hands to work together and come up with a scenario that we all agree upon. That is by design. Right. And what I went into detail with earlier with George is that, you know, even if all three of the scenarios are no good and we all hate them, the community board could produce a scenario of their own, and as with the council. And the council would really play a reconciliation role as well across districts. As we know, community boards are adjacent, and the plan needs to work together across community boards and council districts. Intentionally, we're just, you know, we designed the process so that even council members would have to work together, right? Because multiple council members would represent different community boards, and so they would need to reconcile differences and come up with a plan of their own. And if they didn't, then the city gets to pick. And I really don't think that the council is going to let that happen.
Okay, so then essentially what happened in Sunset Park a few months ago could not happen under this plan.
Say more about what you mean by that.
In that scenario, the council member blocked the rezoning from occurring.
Well, this is not, so the long-term plan is not a rezoning. That's a very important distinction. The long-term plan is a land use framework that will be used to judge future rezoning actions against it. So what I see happening in Sunset Park through this planning process is a community-based envisioning and planning process led by community members, identifying the priorities for what they want to see on that site and the investments they would need in order to accept it, including affordable housing. That would be clearly articulated in a plan, including restrictions on, you know, retail square footage, et cetera. And that would inform what would be put into the final long-term plan and be adopted by the council. Future rezoning applications would have to write a statement of alignment, you know, so Industry City would say, I think I am actually perfectly in conformance with this long-term plan. And let's say it was the application that was, you know, in our hands when it died, you know, that same council member would most likely say, no, it does not conform with my long-term plan. I am triggering this for council review. It would get sent to the council and a very similar scenario would happen. What I hope will happen, which is a very hopeful and naive perspective to have, is that with these, you know, community district infrastructure assessments, this community-driven plan where it identifies exactly what they want to see in the neighborhood and what they don't want to see in the neighborhood, that developer would be forced to meet those needs, right? Like they would have a clearly articulated vision with guideposts for them to work within, and they would be at a negotiating table with a very well-established set of ideas and you know, demands essentially for what they would need to see in order to accept that rezoning, and that would inform that process. You know, I think that is what is best viewed as the council's role in this reconciliation process that we've designed.
Right. Okay, that was it for my questions. It just to me, it sounds like this is kind of a rigid, a way to try and more rigidly conform communities to a predictable schedule. And I just fear that could come at the expense of community concerns. I don't think it eliminates the horse trading. I think it kind of just shifts where that takes place in the process. But I look forward to hearing more.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Ivy, thank you for being so patient. Please ask your question.
Thank you, Elsie. Thank you, Annie, for the presentation, and also for the one from the Met before that. I think one of my huge takeaways was really aligned with what George was saying, was that I think the community-led sort of efforts should be prioritized. And I guess I want to just right now comment on the presentation itself. I think for this body, you know, we're presented with a lot of groups coming in to speak to us, and a lot of information is presented. And I don't know how others feel, but personally, this presentation, I appreciate how much work has gone into it, but it's extremely, there are a lot of words, and I think especially in the visual materials and the PowerPoint, I think, you know, we're people who work during the day on other jobs, and it's quite late, and then to kind of digest all of this is really a lot, and we only have a few hours, and we don't know when we're going to see you next, and then we have to go to our communities and try to relay the information. But if it isn't delivered to us in a way that's concise and clear, it makes that extremely difficult. And so I don't know if some of my other board members agree with me, but I would really like it if you could come back, Annie, and if you could distill each slide into 5 words, or if you could even right now give us a only one or two sentence summary as to the main goal of this. I see this as a lot of procedural information, which I would probably have to block out a whole weekend to go through and pick apart and consider to be able to give more meaningful feedback. But I think the main gist that I hope is clear from visiting with us, and I hope listening to us, because I hope that's the main reason you're here, is that community-led engagement and community-led planning should I think be the way to go. And when you bring the resources to the mayor's office, particularly when we have such political onus on the mayor's office, like when you think about what's going on at de Blasio, and he comes in with this huge housing plan, and people are happy and then people are mad. I mean, there's just such a tide that's constantly going back and forth when it comes to the mayor's office. I think it overly politicizes the planning, and so that is a real danger to me that I see in the way that this plan is presented. Personally, it seems that just for me to understand it better, I really wish that it had started with a kind of very succinct summary of how planning works now, and what does the Department of City Planning do? What does the City Planning Commission do? And what is this plan proposing that these bodies do differently, or that other bodies are now doing? And all these acronyms that have come into your plan now, I'm thinking of like 30 different bodies that are now going to be responsible for planning before people in the community actually get a chance to revise or choose or whatever their own scenarios. And yeah, I got to tell you, I really think that the way this is presented and brought to the community should be revisited. I thank you for all your work and for the fine effort in trying to fix a huge problem, which is, yeah, it's a huge problem. But I think we need to see you again.
Jessica.
Thank you very much, Annie, and Ivy. I'll just follow. I know that this is kind of hot off the press as far as work in progress that the council is pursuing and moving forward. I think any type of comprehensive planning is an enormous undertaking to figure out how to tame the beast in the real estate capital of the world, where real people live and care about their neighbors and what happens on their block and all of those things. So, you know, I think the criticism is apt, but I appreciate your willingness to be so candid in apologizing up front and just diving in. I hope it is a long, evolving process that as much as possible we can continue to be a part of. My question is, OLTPS is responsible for herding the agency cats?
Yes, that's the question. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That is yes.
Okay. And the agency cats are responsible for their actions presented to us as being then in alignment with the long-term plan, correct?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
When agencies come to us with actions and presentations, plans, and projects, those instances will have to be in alignment with the long-term plan.
There would be a lot there to encourage them to do so, but no legal requirement. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yes, it does. So I think, you know, I would encourage, as you continue to do the work, to Ivy's point, and I think Ernie also made a comment clarifying the sort of roles and responsibilities and opportunities for the kind of the community input and what that means for a kind of a long-term plan where the community board is a constant rotation of dedicated community members who can volunteer their time. And I think the institutional knowledge of what happened even 5 years ago, 4 years ago, with the passing of the neighborhood plan and all of the work that went into what happened before that is now not common knowledge always. So I think that challenge is something that I would encourage if there's a way for this process to embed that type of institutional planning knowledge of a place in the sort of scenario, the chosen scenario, the selected scenario. That would be an element that I think would help to provide continuity for committees like ours, a land use and planning committee, that changes year to year to year, but that ultimately cares deeply about the work that it's doing for the neighborhood. So however, that long-term plan can connect to the type of changeover that happens at the board level in service to the kind of the sort of the residents and the constituents in the district. I think that's something that has to be reconciled, and the plan can either help or hurt that, where noticing that agencies often come with a long history. We had an instance of an urban renewal plan that had a long history that was really complicated. It wasn't a sort of a teaching moment to be able to understand why we were doing this together. But it was very much a sort of non-understanding, and we got through it. So I think there's lots of opportunity here to make this about planning together, but it has to be thought through in that targeted way that I think Ivy was asking for. But thank you very much. I think it's a great step.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm gonna allow the 2 attendees hands up. I think everybody here spoke, but I can't see their names fully. Angel, can you help me out with that? The public members, I'm sorry.
Sure, give me a second. Sorry, I turned away. The first hand is Robert Marino. Robert Marino. Okay.
And if you could just keep it as brief as possible.
All right. We're going to move on. Marie
Yeah.
Winfield.
Oh, Marie.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Marie. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I have a couple of questions. I will try and keep it brief. My first question is about the certification process and the alignment with the comprehensive plan. From what I'm understanding from the actual legislative text, it looks like that the process of seeing whether things are consistent with the alignment takes place during the DCP certification process. But then also it looks like DCP is going to promulgate their own rules on whether or not things are consistent with the plan. So it doesn't really, I'm a little bit confused there on how there's really an obligation sort of for the CPC not to, to just to promulgate the own rules through DCP, which makes it easier for them to approve things that are not consistent with the plan, because we see that happening with 197A plans, with community plans, where we see individual ULURP applications and they consistently just take low-hanging fruit off a plan and then say it's consistent with what the community said.
Right.
So that's my first question.
Should I answer that first? Should I answer that first? Or?
Well, the second two are pretty short and are similar. It's just about where it seems like fair share and fair housing both are huge issues that would fall under comprehensive planning, but it seems like the fair share legislative packet is now separate, and it doesn't really seem that it's going to be addressed in a way that fits into the framework here. And the same with the fair housing issue.
that's an issue where the city is supposed to be doing a fair housing assessment. They didn't really do a fair housing assessment. And so likely with the new administration, they should be required to redo it or whatever happens there. It doesn't seem like there's a place to fit in other required things that the city is supposed to do to meet, say, federal law or the fair share. What would be fair share? And then where does community board reform fit in to this plan? Because it seems like it's hard for me to take it seriously when you still have pretty much the same community board budget district need processes. I see the changes that the district needs statements are only happening every 2 years. So I'd like to know what the rationale is for that. But if you don't do community board reform and you're saying you're going to have all these other things, other bodies that have, you know, diverse, underrepresented, and then you get down to the community board level and you're still doing the same not so great district needs assessment, not diverse committees and community and representation of the actual communities, how can that part not have seen any reform in a comprehensive planning framework?
Okay. Thank you for all of those thoughtful questions. I'll start with the CPC question. So the CPC would still be responsible for reviewing, and that's why we've kept the you know, the same checks and balances in place that are in place right now with ULURP, where the council would have the power to review and call up the application that conflicts with the plan. The second question that you asked, I believe, was about community board resources. Is that right?
No, and just with the, could you please answer about the DCP certification part? That just seems like not the right place to find out alignment for the plan. Right now, either it goes in the garbage or DCP certifies things that are not even complete. How does DCP promulgating its own rules on whether it aligns on the plan to the plan? Nobody else tells them what to do. They decide how they're going to decide whether it aligns to the plan. That just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
No, I mean, I don't think you are. And I think this is more of a comment than a question. I think you understand the proposal at hand, and that's why we've kept the council review in place.
Okay. The second question was about the fair housing and the fair share process and the separate processes that don't seem to be included in.
So we've built in several places in the bill, the assessment of fair housing and segregation is in the conditions of the city report. We also included the social indicators report in that conditions of the city report as well, which assesses, you know, disparities with respect to city agency services, as well as the assessment of the city facilities, which is something that is actually not done right now and would be basically a fair share assessment. So all of that is in the conditions of the city report. The main driver for sort of like where and how to distribute housing with respect to fair housing and just affordable housing broadly writ and development is based on Seattle's model. I can show you sort of about so this is this equity analysis. These two indices, can you see the two maps on the right that I'm showing? Okay. This is an access to opportunity map and a displacement risk map. And these are overlaid, basically multiple demographic and other types of conditions data to sort of assess access to opportunity and displacement risk, and then prioritize growth in the neighborhood. High access to opportunity and low risk for displacement. This is a very straightforward and enforceable way that we can legislate the development and growth in our neighborhoods in a way that we believe will be more equitable. So that is how we approached that issue.
But that's I'm sorry to clarify.
The second part of your question, I believe, was how other types of plans would fit into this process. I'm a big supporter of fair share. The reason that those bills are not incorporated into, or one of the reasons they're not incorporated into the comp planning bill, is in part because those bills were already introduced as a package and need to go through the legislative process on their own. So that is a standalone reform package, and this would fit into it through this conditions of the city report, essentially. And the fair housing report that the city did, I mean, really a lot of its recommendations pointed straight towards needing to do this exact type of analysis with respect to equitable outcomes and prioritizing growth in areas with high access to opportunity. As it sounds like you read the report. So this is really building on that work. It would not replace or supplant it. This does not, relate to federal requirements with respect to fair housing, except that it would be required to comply with it, right? So
But what I'm saying is that the fair housing report, I'm just saying why there could be language that talks about meeting federal requirements. The reason why I'm asking, and this will be my last comment, is just that even just recently, like in December, one of the city agencies had to suspend a program because they're worried that it's not meeting federal fair housing requirements. There are things that could be in the legislation that are specific to evaluating whether or not just like looking at, oh, here's a map and here's what has been inequitable in the past, but looking at the city's current policies, its own policies that also will be developed in the plan, and whether or not those are actually equitable. Not just saying this is historic, but there are current segregation policies, different inequitable policies currently, which the fair housing or pretty much any strategic planning in the city does not do well. And it seems like analysis of the city's own plan should somehow be looked at in the legislation. Otherwise, you're still doing the same things that you were doing before. You're just looking at the data.
So you're saying
just
that
more data.
I'm sorry. So I just wanted to jump in real quick because I know that this will eventually end up at a hearing, and we will have opportunities to really, even though I know from past experiences also that when it gets to the hearing point, we're there, right? But I do know, and I've heard from George, that we are, that you guys are still cultivating and still taking in information. So I think it's important for people to get that information out. And I think as a committee, we will have to continue to talk about this and continue to add things into the conversation. I mean, obviously we see that community engagement and planning from community up instead of down is something that we value. But we'll get to all of that. And we will be obviously kind of formulating some, hopefully, some information that can add on to the planning process. George, did you have one last thing?
Just one brief comment. And I know that there's been some criticism by members of the committee. I just think that one of the things that I think needs to be said is that comprehensive planning is not radical. Nearly every city does it. Nearly every big city does it. In America, in the Western world, comprehensive planning is common. And I've been involved in many of them, and it's a great process. And, New York City should have a comprehensive plan. I think that's a kind of no-brainer. It's not special. We're not like exceptional. But it's the details that matter, right? The details matter a lot. And I think that's, at least from my perspective and in my opinion, is that this is a conversation about the details. And I think the fact that we're talking about comprehensive planning at all is fantastic. And that, the fact that Annie's here talking with you all just a few weeks after this was introduced is even better. So, the fact that she's going to other community boards, it's fantastic. So, I think that just needed to be said.
And I agree, George. I think that, obviously, I don't remember the last time we were the first community board committee to get a presentation from the New York City Council. So kudos to that. And I think we can all agree that comprehensive planning is something that we need in the city. But a lot of us have been around to kind of get lost in the sauce when a lot of these plans come up and then have to deal with that on the tail end of it. And then our community members suffer from not really being involved in that planning, especially when it comes to how communities envision building in their tiny world. So we have to keep an eye out on it, and we will continue to be present for these conversations. And we do thank you for the opportunity to look through it. Jason did share a link earlier in the chat for all of those who want to see that. It was also embedded in, I think, one of the agenda items. So we have access to this. If anybody has more information, please feel free to send out an email to the committee and to us as members so we can continue this dialogue, and we will obviously pass that along to Annie and anywhere else you think that it would be helpful. I don't know if there's a website that's taking comments or.
So this is going to go through the regular legislative process. The hearing is the next step. I would really encourage you all to, make as specific and concrete recommendations with respect to amendments as possible. I am just one person on a very large team representing an entire body that would need to vote on this legislation. I am not the final decision maker. And so I need as much information and recommendations that are concrete that could really be adapted into the, legislation itself as you can provide that would help us improve this and make it great. So that's all I'll leave you with, is that as you have your conversations, because we're working in a very sort of narrow tool of just our legislation, which can be very complicated and difficult to explain, but unfortunately really cannot be simplified without skipping a lot of important details that many different groups care about. So I would really encourage you to, just be as concrete as possible in submitting testimony and having future conversations.
Great. Thank you so much. Jason, did your hand just go up, or is that, I can't tell?
Yeah, it was more for the committee than for Annie. Annie, thank you for your presentation. Sounds like we're going to be talking a lot. Elsie, my loud thought was to address some of the concerns of our body is for committee members, and it seems like there's even people volunteering to help out. So maybe we could write all these questions, send them to Annie, get the responses in writing, and carry on with the project as necessary.
Agreed.
And again, Annie, thank you for bringing this, and George and Angel for red flagging this, because this addresses some of the concerns that was brought up by the committee as it relates to legislation or these administrative agencies making these mass changes without giving us a heads up. So I definitely want to give kudos to that as well. Thank you all.
And intertwining budget in there as well. Definitely. All right, Angel, did you fall asleep on us yet?
I'm trying to fall asleep, and you guys just won't be quiet.
I'm just making sure.
George got all excited and he woke me up. I did want to say, also wanted to thank Annie for the presentation. I actually really like presentations with a lot of text, but I do understand that some audiences like need to present it differently. The one thing that, and I know this is later in the conversation, but the one thing that came to mind, because everybody else raised the points that I was thinking, was what about a scenario where, and Andrew brought up a good point about council member deference. What about if the council member is no good? What about if the council member decides to take a position that is contrary to the position that a community board that a community has put forward, and that the commission has seen as, okay, well, this complies with the community's wishes? What about a scenario where the council member wants to go opposite of that? What then? Just a verbal tongue lashing, or is there like some mechanism to stop that?
Then it's just war at that point, Angel. I don't know.
No.
Not gonna vote, right?
Well, sure. We can figure out the fighting afterwards. But Annie, has that been contemplated?
I mean, you're saying after the final long-term plan is adopted?
Yeah.
The process right now would not really look very different with respect to how your rezonings would be considered. So that would continue to be something that would need to be dealt with in however you saw fit, whether electorally or otherwise.
Right. Well, that's the reason I bring that up is because it's discouraging. to get, a community behind, these 50 guys is easy to get, well, not easy, but it's possible to get them on board with talking about these kinds of things. But a larger community engaged in these things, like you have to cut through a lot of cynicism. And if the idea is out there that a council member could act counter to their wishes, like it's hard to get people on board. I guess in fairness, since I'm saying it twice, I'm not expecting you to resolve this, but I think it's something that should be discussed.
Understood.
Yeah. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're gonna let you go.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Anna.
Have a good one.
All right, guys, we are at 8:31, which is early for a lot of our meetings, but late for just today. So, because I am tired and I'm sure you are too. So, Angel, what else do we have on the agenda?
So we had goals and accomplishments. I was thinking we could probably just table that till next month.
Yeah, and also our chair is not here, so I would love to have him part of the conversation as well.
I did have a note that I needed to share with you guys in advance of next month's meeting. I'm sorry, I will email it to you guys because I can't find it. I'm not gonna have you wait till I flip through papers.
Great, appreciate it. So that was it. That was the end of it. So Jason, I saw something over there.
That's all she
Want to
wrote.
raise your hand, Jason?
Motion.
Motion to what, Jason?
Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Oh, Francis.
This is in the building.
Yeah, the mic works.
Francis, we finally hear you.
The mic works now, Francis.
Her mic is working, guys. All right. Andrew, could you please do roll? Can we just
Yeah, just acclamation. They all want to leave. It's fine.
I know, me too. All right, guys. All in favor?
Aye.
The deed is done, the die is cast.
That's right, the
We're
famous
good.
line.
We're good. All right, everyone. Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night, guys.
Good night, guys.
Bye.